In order to be a successful author, you must have every single detail of your plot and plan figured out before you can begin writing.
Whoa, 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 whoa. That's not true. If you are new here, my name is Sarra Cannon. I am the indie author of more than 27 novels. I've been doing NaNoWriMo now for over a dozen years, and I'm excited to get started on all of this Preptober work. But whether you're doing NaNoWriMo or not, I hope this video is going to be helpful for you. This is the Heart Breathings channel, and I'm excited you're here. Let's get started. So there really is no one size fits all to plotting and planning and getting ready for your novel. There will be as many different ways to plot and write a book as there are authors. It is really unique to each of us and sometimes to each book that we're writing. And really, it's one of the most beautiful and exciting parts of being a writer is the freedom that you have to be creative, to make the decisions, to find your voice and to express yourself. But it's also one of the most frustrating and difficult parts of being a writer because you have to figure it out. And there is no guidebook that tells you as an individual how to be the very best author you can be. All we can do is learn from each other, share what works and what doesn't work, and then in the end, learn to trust our own intuitive ability to tell stories. So trust yourself for sure. As we discuss planning your novel, specifically for NaNoWriMo, but for any time of year, I wanted to approach this topic a little bit different than I have in the past because I have some videos on this topic before. But first, we're going to talk about the different types of writers and different types of processes. Then we'll talk about the types of things that you can plan. And then I'm going to show you what my planning process is for this nano. So there are lots of different types of writer planners. So you have plotters. Now, obviously, plotters are people who want to figure out the plot ahead of time. So they tend to outline their novel. They tend to know the structure. A lot of times, plotters will figure out characters and settings and all these things I'm going to talk about in a minute. They'll figure these things out before they start writing. So for a plotter, pre-writing is often more work than the writing itself. And so it's a matter of figuring out scenes and outlines and character arcs and emotions and different things like that. That is not to say that all plotters are created equally. Some plotters have every tiny detail, stacks of note cards, pages and pages of world building. I have a friend that writes 50 plus pages of outline before she even starts writing. So you've got that type of plotter, but you also have plotters that really just figure out the major basic plot points, a few things about their characters, and then they move forward. So a plotter can be any part of that spectrum. Then you also have pantsers. Pantsers are typically people who fly by the seat of their pants. They may have an idea for a character, a spark of an idea for a scene, and then they're off to the races. And they're discovery writers at heart, people who discover their story as they write and then, craft it as they go. There are also people who don't fit into the exact definition of pantser or plotter. And I was at a conference once and I heard the term puzzler, and it just always cracks me up because it sounds like a Batman villain or something, but it does resonate with me because it shared a part of my own process that I didn't think was right because I had never heard anyone talking about it before. So a puzzler is basically someone who has bits and pieces of their story. So they may know a scene here or a character here, and then they take those pieces and then they start to build their story from those pieces, but not necessarily in chronological order. So a puzzler might get an idea for a scene, go ahead and draft that scene, write something about the character, figure out a couple things that happen here and there, get an idea from that scene about how the end is going to go, and then start writing again and keep coming back to that puzzle. And then the picture begins to clarify itself over time rather than just being like, I'm going to plot the whole thing in chronological order and then write it. A puzzler might go back and forth between their writing and figuring things out and not doing their writing in chronological order. For some books, this is the way that I have to do it. For The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, that's the way I'm doing it because it's in alternate timelines. And so I'm writing pieces and discovering pieces as I go. Some people are what is lovingly known as plantsers, which is somewhere in between a plotter and a pantser, where you have a basic idea of your structure, you start writing, and then at some point you go off outline and you just start pantsing from there on. This is also sometimes the way that I am. I will have outlines and scene cards and everything else. And then that act one climax will twist things in a direction I didn't see coming. And I will take that inspiration and just move forward excitedly, flying by the seat of my pants until I need to come back and start plotting again when I get stuck. And so one of the things I want you to understand and really want to drive home as we start talking about how to plan your novel is this truth that there is no right or wrong way. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to be ashamed of being somebody who doesn't know anything when you get started. It's truly okay to just be yourself and to follow your own process. And that process might not look specifically like anything you've seen on YouTube or heard from writers before, and that is okay. Once you start to open your mind to the fact that you can really make your own rules, I think it starts to open up the possibilities of how you can plan. Now, if you have written a lot of novels before, then what I encourage you when you start to do your planning for this next book is to really lean into the things that have worked for you before. Really stop and think about, when were you most successful in your writing, and what process did you follow? How can you recreate that or replicate that? What problems did you have? Where did you get stuck in that writing process? And how can you avoid it this time? And just taking that little bit of time to review your previous books and how things went might set you up in such a big way for success moving forward. If you have never written a novel before and this is your first attempt, you might not understand what your writing process is, but you can look for other clues in your life as to what type of writer you might be. So for example, the last time you planned a big vacation or a wedding or some other big event, did you enjoy and naturally gravitate toward an entire planner, writing out every detail, having, your flight numbers, and you knew exactly what restaurants you were going to and your reservations were booked way in advance? Like, did you plan every detail? If so, you might also gravitate toward being a plotter when it comes to your writing. Or did you just buy the tickets on the whim and head out with nothing but your suitcase and prayer? If so, you might be somebody who says, I didn't have a plan. I'm going to just go for it. In fact, when I went to Europe when I was in my 20s, I had a detailed plan of everything I was going to do. I was going to visit every opera house. I was going to do all these things. I had an exact itinerary planned. And the very first week that I was in Europe, I tore that itinerary up and I decided to just go for it and see where life took me. And that is often the way my novels are too. In order to get up the courage to start writing, I like to have a good idea of what's happening. And then sometimes when inspiration strikes, I throw out that outline and then I just move forward. So think about how you've been in the past in your life and how that might correlate to what type of writer you might be and what your process is. So if you have done NaNoWriMo before or you have written novels before, it is also super helpful to think about where you've gotten stuck in the past. Last NaNoWriMo, for example, did you create a big outline and then 2 weeks in, you were through all of your content and you had no idea what else to do, or you were so far off your outline, you didn't know where to continue? Or did you decide you were going to pants it and you made it 3 days in and then had no idea what was going to happen next? So think about where your sticking points are and where you've sort of fallen short in the past, and then make a plan for what you're going to do when you get stuck this time. Maybe if you ran out of outline last time, you need more ideas for what's going to happen next. You need to plot more. Maybe if you pantsed it and then you just couldn't figure out anything to write, maybe you need a few more details. Like maybe it would be helpful for you to go ahead and figure out your characters, figure out what the ending is or the main conflict, and just journal about a few of those things. You don't have to plot everything, but maybe a few more details would be helpful. Or maybe you plotted to perfection and then you froze, or it felt too constricting to have so much of the plot figured out and you just couldn't find the inspiration to write. If that was you last year or on your last novel, maybe you want to plan less this time. So really think about your past work. And if you have not ever had any past work, then just think about your process when it comes to planning other things in your life and then do the best you can to plan for Nano. So let's talk about the types of things that you might want to plan. So one is characters. And I do have a video during this Preptober series coming about how to plan out your character's arc. So that's going to be super fun. But you can plan what your characters look like, what their trajectory is, what their history is, what kind of person they are. I have friends that do Enneagrams and Myers-Briggs personality tests or archetypes, different things like that. So you can get as into it as you want, or you can just write a couple of lines about each character, like he has brown eyes and he's a real jerk, whatever it is you want to write. But getting some idea of the people that will be moving around in your world, what they look like, what they act like, what their basic personality is, can be super helpful, even if you're a pantser, if that calls to you. So another thing that you could figure out is the setting of your novel. So is it going to happen all in one main location? So for example, my Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw that I'm currently working on mostly happens at the site of one lake house cabin. So I could be thinking, how many floors are there? How many bedrooms? Is it super rustic or is it kind of glam? Is it an older home? Is it relatively new? Is it really big? Is there a basement? Is there a boat ramp? Are there a lot of trees around? And I could be thinking about the general decor and setup and basic layout of this space because my characters are going to be moving around in it. And maybe I don't want to make those decisions later. If you're writing a fantasy world, there's so much about setting and world building that you could figure out ahead of time. What's the government of this place? What type of diversity is it? What type of creatures or animals lurk in the forest? What type of weapons do they use? Do they have cars? What's the technology? There's a lot of decisions that you could sit and make. Now, some of those things you might discover as you're writing your rough draft, but having a basic framework of what this society is like or what this world is like can go a long way when it comes to planning your novel. If you are writing fantasy or magic, it can also be super helpful to figure out what are the rules of this magic system or of this world. So I'm writing a paranormal potential ghost story. So what are the rules of this ghost story? Can the ghost actually interact with humans? Are they going to see the ghost? Is it going to be able to touch them? Like, is it going to be a scary ghost? I can make up those types of rules. If I was writing in my Shadow Demon saga, I might be thinking broader, like who are the Fae? What are their rules? How do you cast spells? How do you get access to magic? All of those kinds of things. What does the magic look like when you cast it? And again, if you're a pantser, you may not want to figure this stuff out ahead of time, but if you are somewhere in between, you might want to spend some time really journaling and thinking about what that magic system looks like. So then we have, of course, the plot. And the plot is really what's going to happen in your story, the outline of what's going to happen in your story. So this is a lot of where I focus my time when it comes to planning and prepping for NaNoWriMo. And I actually happen to have a lot of resources here on my channel if you're interested in plot. There are so many different ways and methods that you can use. There's the traditional 3-act structure. There's Save the Cat Writes a Novel. There is the snowflake method, the plot embryo, Dan Harmon's story circle. And none of them are like right or wrong. It's just what speaks to you and what gets your imagination going. I tend to use the 3-act structure. So I have an entire video series here on YouTube called How to Plot Your Novel. And it comes with this great free workbook. And that workbook is actually what I use to plot my novel. So I'm going to show that to you in just a minute. I know many of you have seen it before, but you'll see the new setup of everything. Also, I do have a series on how to write a series. And in that we talk about world building. So there's a workbook that goes with that as well. And then I have one of my most recent series is how to write scenes. And in that is probably the most detailed explanation I've ever given of how to go from idea into developing what actually happens next in your story on a granular, like scene by scene level. So if you haven't watched that yet, I would highly encourage you checking that out if you think you want to plan by scenes. So lots of great stuff out there. I'm going to link all those playlists and videos for you, and definitely come join my mailing list where I have a Preptober workbook for you. And I also have tons of other resource on plotting and editing and world building and writing scenes inside that resource library that you'll get access to. Hey, so this is the fun room. This is my writing room. If you are new to my channel, this time last year for Prep and NaNoWriMo, my family did not have a home. We had been renting for 5 years, a couple of different places in Charleston. We had been building a house, and then because of COVID prices, that build got canceled, and then we had nowhere to live because our rental was already re-rented. So we were living in Airbnbs, and we lived in, I think, 12 over the course of several months. And so we were traveling quite a bit. So this house is the first time that we've had a place of our own that we actually owned, that we were home in, that we could feel secure in for years to come, in a decade. And it just feels so good. And I'm lucky enough that we had a space in a fourth bedroom that I could create as my writing room. So I have all my tools, all my planning stuff set up here. And this is really where I'm hoping the magic will happen, because I have really struggled with my own writing over the past few years. And it's the planning I kind of lean into pretty hard, but it's the follow through where I keep getting stuck. So here's how kind of my planning has gone in the past, and what I'm hoping about my process will help carry me through to actually finishing my first book this year during Nano. So when I start a new book and I start my planning process, I will often create spaces for me to plot and structure or outline my novel. One of the places I like to use is any kind of wall or large space so that I can visually set out what's going to happen. Now, in this house, I happen to have an entire wall that I can use. In our previous rental house, I just used the wall behind the front door. So it wasn't really beautiful. It was out in the middle of everything, but it was the only wall in the house that I could use. And luckily, my husband didn't mind. So I have easel paper that I just got off of Amazon, and I just roll it onto the wall and use masking tape or painter's tape so that I don't mess up the wall. And I can use Tombow dual brush pens, flip chart markers, or Crayola super tips on this, and it's not going to bleed through. And basically this is the 3-act structure. So you have act 1, and then you have act 2 is the largest part of most novels, movies, and other types of modern stories. And so there's kind of a part 1 and there's a part 2. And in the middle of it is the middle of your story, or the midpoint of your story, which is often a kind of this changes everything sort of moment. And then you have act 3 over here on the end, which for me typically is the shortest of the 3 acts. So having it visually arranged like this allows me to expand my mind to visually see what is happening in my story. And when I'm planning my story, I like to use both sticky notes and other media to create the story grid. So over here, I do have another little one just because I had space that kind of walks you through or reminds me of the 8 characters, because I have 8 points of view. So I've color coded them, and this kind of reminds me of that. And then I will be putting their character arcs up on here. And then over on this side, I have a little bucket that has all of the Post-it notes for the color codes. And then I've got my markers, some dot markers, and some other pens and things in the color code. Now, just as a quick tip, when you're deciding, if you decide you want to color code your novel, I highly recommend color coding according to, like, choosing colors that you can easily get like at your local office supply store. So you wouldn't want to choose like teal or some other kind of color that's difficult to get in a Post-it note if you wanted to be able to use them, because then it's hard to like coordinate your Post-its with your markers. Whereas if you're using basic colors like orange, pink, blue, green, you can find them in any store. I will use both this. Now, if you don't have a wall or you don't have this much space to yourself, you can use poster board that you tape together and you kind of fold it and put it behind a bookcase so that it can be out of sight when you want it to be. You could also just use a roll like this and roll it out on the floor and use it, and then roll it up and put it away in the closet every night. So there are other solutions. Or if you don't need something big, you can just use a planner. So this is what I tend to use. So I used to use a big happy planner. This is discs bound system so that you can pull the pages easily out and put them back in. But now I use a smaller version. This is the classic size happy planner. But I wanted to kind of show you an example of a completed novel for me where I have basically that same story structure laid out in a planner that I have up on the wall. And I use page flags. So something like this that you can get at any office supply store, they're just page flags, and they're
Usually I will use the paper ones for this, but if you decide that you want to use plastic ones, like something more like these sort of plastic page flags, then you would need something like a Sharpie marker to write on them because a regular pen is just going to smear. But what I love to do is I love to sit down with a visual representation of the 3 acts, color codes if I'm going to use them in terms of page flags and stuff, and start thinking about what are the scenes that I already know in this book. So, do I know how it starts? Do I know what that midpoint is that changes everything? Can I see like visually that final scene or final battle in my head? I may not know all the details, but I know that it's going to be Parrish against this person, or it's going to be the whole group gathers together in the middle of downtown New York. Like I might have a few small things already figured out. So I will write those scenes that I know on these page flags and add them where I think they go. Now, as an example, when I first started plotting, I still used this basic structure, but I just did it in pen. So you can see here, I've got all of this. This is my first published novel, and I just kind of wanted to pull this out. I've never shown these, I don't think, before. And this wasn't my first draft of this. This was probably the 6th or 7th draft. So I will figure things out. It'll change, it'll shift. I'll write a little bit of the book, and then I'll come back to it. And so this was like the final iteration of it. But I realized very quickly that when you're writing with pen, you can't really move scenes around as easily. So that's when I started using page flags so that I could, if I decided this scene actually needed to happen in Act 1, I could easily move it around. I also wanted to share that this is a later book in my career, and you can see that I never even plotted half of Act 2. Because sometimes for me, I'm a mix of that. I'm more of that puzzler person. I may know and write some of the ending scenes. I may know and write some of the beginning. But then some of this, I'm just going to pants because there's no way I can actually figure out what happens here until I'm writing it. So I'm a mix of a discovery writer and a plotter. But I plot a lot. But some things are just left up to figuring it out at the time. And so that's why I started this video with kind of talking about those 3 different processes, because if you can figure out how much of this planning and how much of the story do you need to understand before you're ready to start putting it on paper, you're going to be so much better off. And in fact, if you're a pantser, don't look at this and think that this means nothing to you or you could never use it. Because one way you could potentially use it is either in your editing process when you're reevaluating your novel and trying to mix it up and move things around, or as you're writing. Let's say it's the end of your writing process for the day. You could potentially sit down and say, well, I wrote this scene, this scene, this scene, and just add it to your story grid. And then when you sit down tomorrow, you can add tomorrow's scenes so that by the time you're finished with your novel, you have a clear layout of what you did write, even though you didn't have this wasn't a pre-writing thing for you. This was a as you go kind of thing, which might help you with your editing. So there's all different kinds of ways. So how do I figure out what happens in each of these scenes? So I have recently created a video about how to figure out what happens in your scene. So if you haven't watched that yet, I highly recommend that you watch it. But something that I wanted to say in this particular video that I feel needs to be said in the community is just that I think it can feel like when you see something like this, or you see a story grid, or you see a completed novel, it seems like the process for that writer was that they just sat down, the idea of what to happen next just came to them easily, and then they wrote it out chronologically, and then there was a book. And this is really like a myth. This is not something that happens to most of us, and I don't even know anyone this really happens to. Maybe if you're writing very short formulaic stories, it can be a little bit easier to just kind of plug and play because your stories are more similar. But for most of us, it takes time, and it's a process of back and forth. So you might figure out a little bit about what happens in Act 1. And the way you do that is you learn about how stories are, and you think about what's the main conflict. How does my story begin? Where am I starting? And how does my character get pulled into this new world of love, or this new world of mystery, or, whatever happens? What's that inciting incident? And once you start to visually see that, you start planning those scenes. And then when you start writing, it might all change. And then you have to come back to the plan and you have to figure it out. It's a messy process. So I want to encourage you by saying, let it be messy. Just get in. Don't give up on yourself. And I think this is really part of how I've failed myself over the past couple of years, because I have been so determined to force it to come together that I haven't been willing to get in and play with it, because I don't have enough time to just sit and think about the story. And so this is something I'm changing in my life now and hopefully moving forward. And I hope this is why I'm going to be successful this year for NaNoWriMo Diaries in actually finishing a book this year, because I want to remind myself that writing a novel is a messy process. It is not likely that I'm going to sit down and be able to plan this novel from start to finish with no issues and then sit down and write it from start to finish. There's going to be pieces that don't come together as easily, and there's going to be work involved. And so I hope that you feel encouraged by that, because everyone's process is messy and it's okay for yours to be messy too. Okay, so let's dive in just a little bit to this planning process. So first of all, if you're using 3-act structure or Save the Cat or anything that you have studied before in order to figure out the plot of your story, I highly recommend making yourself some kind of like cheat sheets or notes about it. So for me, I have taken all of my favorite books on writing and I have created these little story guides, I guess, or cheat sheets that are like, okay, the disturbance is a plot point that I know I want to start the book with. So here's what these books that I love say about the disturbance. So it serves as a kind of reminder of what that plot point is all about, so that when I get stuck, so for example, if I'm like, what was the doorway of no return number 2? Like this end of the second act. Okay, the lead passes through a doorway, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that reminds me, it triggers a memory of the studying that I did. So kind of like if you're a good student, which I am a learner by nature, a student by nature. So this really helps me to have this sort of cheat sheet reminder of what happens in each of those plot points. Then, like I said, I have this now classic happy planner that I just created through these discs I bought on Etsy. These are little dragonfly discs. And I also bought this cover on Etsy. And most of it is either things that I've printed out, or it's a combination of that and a few of my happy planner pages. So I have my word count tracker in here. Now you can find this inside your own Preptober planner if you wanted to download that. And a lot of these resources you can find for free in my resource library. All you have to do is sign up for my email list, and I'll send you a link to a Google Drive folder that has all of this stuff in it. And basically, this is how I like to track. And I follow that process that I told you about in the Preptober planner flip through to figure out how many sprints I'm going to need to do to finish my book. So that is the word count tracker that I have all printed out. Sometimes I will put the book cover in here as well, just as motivation if you already have it. And then I have my plotting sheets. Now you can see, because I'm already working on this book, that some of these are already filled out. Now, these are sheets that I created, but you could create any sheets you wanted based on the books you've read or the studying you've done or the process that you have. But I like to have a couple pages where I work on my character arc and what I know about my character and why they're involved in this story. And then I get into the actual plot of the novel. So for me, 3-act structure. Act 1, opening scene, the setting, the dramatic question, the argument against transformation, the doorway of no return, the key event, stuff like that. Now, I didn't fill this out on this sheet because some of it is still tentative, but I did write it out on another piece of paper. So a lot of times what I will do is I will just print out dot grid paper that I bought off of Etsy, and I will put it into the planner to use for my notes. And then I just have one of these disc hole punches. So I have most of Act 1 figured out, and a lot of Act 2 is not figured out. But here's where I was talking about knowing your process. All of the ending stuff, I know. Like, I can see that in my head. I know exactly how this story ends. The stuff that I'm still kind of puzzling out is, this is Lorelai. She's the main character, and she's the one who's mostly driving the narrative in the present. But there are going to be flashbacks of each of these characters and all the stuff that happened leading up to the disappearance of Vanessa Shaw. And as Lorelai sort of investigates what happened, she's going to discover everybody's secrets that they were hiding. And eventually she's going to hopefully find the truth. So I know the beginning and I know the end, but it's this middle part that I don't necessarily know. So what I'm going to be doing in my personal planning for now, I'm going to be working on this book in the month of October, but also probably continuing on to December. I don't know yet. We'll see how I doubt I'm going to finish this in October. We'll just put it that way, but you never know. So what I'm going to be doing for myself next is I am going to be spending some time thinking about each character and how they play a role and how each one of their secrets gets discovered. Now, I already know what each of their secrets are. So this is one of those things of like figuring out your own process and how much of the story you need to have figured out before you're ready to write. So for me, I knew that in order for this to all come together, I needed to know who the real killer was so that I could kind of work backwards in hiding that from the reader. And I knew that I was going to need to figure out what each character's secret is. So the tagline for this particular book is, everyone there had a reason to want Vanessa gone, including me. And so everybody there has some kind of secret or reason that they hated Vanessa or that they wanted her to not spill the beans on their secrets or something like that. So I have all of the different characters and kind of their just basics about who they were. I have more about Lorelai here because she's my main character. And then I have detailed secrets here. I won't hold on to that too long because I know there's some of you are excited to read this book when it's done, but I know what all of their secrets are. So my next point of planning is to figure out, how does Lorelai learn their secrets over the course of the present day night? And how does that come into the story in terms of the flashbacks? And so I've got some work to do, right? I am going to be using this Happy Planner page that I've kind of created as a plotting planner. I've got my page flags here where you can see I actually have all of Act 1 figured out, a smidgen of Act 2 Part 1. And then I do actually have Act 3 figured out. I just haven't put them on page flags yet. So it's this middle part here. And in between some of Lorelai's point of view, I do want to add in some more of these other alternate flashbacks. So this is kind of the planning for me. But as you can see, it's not like I sat down and said this, and it's all figured out. By the time I get ready to start actually writing this, which if you know, I've already written 20,000 words like years ago, so I'm kind of editing the first part of it. I would love to have that beginning, the midpoint, and the end figured out because that's my process. But I don't actually need to have all of this part of Act 2 figured out because that will come as I'm writing. And I can trust myself that that will come. So it's a mix of plotting and then coming back to it over and over. But for the first time ever, I'm actually going to also be using this fun grid paper. So this is just like graph paper in a big tablet. This is probably like for designers and stuff. I don't know, engineers. Probably not specifically designed for writers, but I saw my friend Holly Black was using this and I decided I wanted to try to use it myself. And I think how I'm going to use this is I'm going to structure this out with each character and their secret, and then Lorelai, like their secret and how that secret came to be known by Vanessa in the past, because those will be the flashback scenes. And then on the page also saying present day Lorelai, how does she find out about it? And what does that tell you? Does that tell the reader that this is the person that killed Vanessa, or how does that play into the main role? So I'm going to probably segment this out by character and then have it and then write out those scenes and figure out those scenes here. And then I probably also will use some of these sheets for a basic timeline of not only the past, so I'll do a timeline of the past and then a timeline of the present. So here's what happened leading up to the night Vanessa disappeared. And then here's what happened when they go back to the cabin. And here's Vanessa, or here's Lorelai's trajectory of how she figured out or here's Lorelai's timeline of how she figures out what happened to Vanessa. So I think this will be really fun and cool to use. Another thing that I do like to use is index cards. So I have an entire video on how to plan your novel using index cards. And here I have the 4 points of view for my Shadow Demon Saga, which I'm going to talk about more in my video coming up about how to plot POV, multiple POV and series books. But I also do have some index cards for this book. Instead of using index cards that are colorful for Vanessa Shaw, I decided to just use white index cards and then use the pens to delineate the different points of view, because I couldn't find all the colors that I wanted, like orange and yellow post-it, or orange and yellow and pink cards. So I'm just using the colorful pens to color code on those. But I do like to sometimes have these on note cards, especially if you decide that you're going to participate in some of the NaNoWriMo write-ins. It can be really nice because you might not have the space on the table to bring an entire big plotting notebook, but you should be able to fit, you know, a small handful of index cards if you would like to take those with you. But for me, that's kind of the next step in my plan. I am not going to print out this workbook that I have for each of the characters, like the point of view characters in this particular book, because they don't all have a character arc. In this book, it's really just more focused on their flashbacks and their secrets, but the main character who has an arc is Lorelai. So she's the one that I'm focused on for this book, but I will share coming up when I start talking about my book 12 of my Shadow Demon Saga, the 4 main characters. There's 6 characters in that book, but there's 4 main characters and they each do have their own full character arc. So it's a different kind of way of writing when it comes to that. So we'll talk about that in a future video. But when I am actually planning, if I were starting from scratch, what I would do is I would print out this workbook, which again, you can grab for free. And I would start filling out everything I know about the characters and then start filling out the scenes that I know, and understanding that it's not always going to be that I know every scene in order. Sometimes I'm going to know one here and one here and one here and one here. And then I'm going to gradually begin to build my plot, just like putting together a puzzle. And then once I have as much as I feel I need to feel inspired to start writing, then I know I'm ready for Nano. So I hope you found this helpful. And if there's anything that I missed or any of those videos that you see on my channel that you would like to see more of or more details on, just let me know.
Okay, that's it for planning your novel. And I have some other videos about how to plan your novel using index cards and other things like that. So if you've got some time on your hands and you're deep into prep mode, definitely go watch some of those videos. I'll have them all linked for you down below. Coming up on Sunday, we have my October planner set up. And then next week, we're going to continue our Preptober content with a look at how to create character profiles and character arcs. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to have my favorite video that I've planned for this entire Preptober period, which is how to plan your life for writing a novel, non-writing stuff, but how to meal prep your clothes, prep your family, get your life in schedule ready to go to write a novel. I'm so excited to share this with you, and I hope you've enjoyed this Preptober content so far. Definitely subscribe to this channel, join this amazing Hearties community, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.